What I realized at that point, sitting there about 14 years ago in Portland, Maine, this was the Atlantic Northeast. This is the least churched part of the country. It's the place where you have more and more congregations and sanctuaries that are 200 and 300 years old that are mostly empty on Sunday morning. And here was a group of pastors who were saying, whatever we do in the sanctuary on Sunday morning can't compete with soccer and Starbucks and the Sunday New York Times, and our churches are dying. What do you have to say about that? Go with me, if you will, on a little journey from Portland, Maine to Alabama. One of my friends on a workshop and a consultation that I did, a project for our denomination, he had spent his entire life in the Presbyterian Church in Alabama. And I asked him, he said he was close to retirement. He'd been there 40 years. And I said, we're talking a lot about a changing world in church. I'm from Los Angeles. You're here in Alabama. You're like in the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. So have you had any changes going on in your life? And he looked at me and he said, oh, here, you got to realize, Todd, it's dramatically changed. He said 40 years ago in Alabama, we never kept track of church membership, church attendance, church growth, anything like that. We didn't keep track of it. And the reason why we didn't is because 40 years ago in Alabama, if a man skipped church on Sunday, his boss asked him about it at work on Monday. When your family's economic thriving is dependent upon your church attendance, guess what it does to church attendance? See, what he was referring to was the way in which the thing that is changing so dramatically is not so much that there's a greater need for Christ, but that there is less and less of a Christian home court advantage in our culture. That that a generation ago, more parts of culture supported Christianity. So if you ever come visit me in Pasadena, California, come to my office and ask to see my copy of the Los Angeles Times from December 1963. I have a copy of it because someone kept it, because it had a copy, the front page was all about the Kennedy assassination and the Warren Commission. It was a historical document. They gave it to me because it had a copy, it had an article on the back page of that front section on the then 8,000 member Hollywood Presbyterian Church. A church that when I served, it had about 4,000 members when I was an associate pastor there, and that today has about 600 in worship. The reason why I kept it, however, is that there was a box in the LA Times that morning in 1963 where the LA Times published for you a week's worth of daily Bible readings. A generation ago, the Los Angeles Times helped you with your morning quiet time. That world where the structures of the world support Christianity is what's changed. If you go into almost any small town, I've been all over the country this last couple of years, it's been a great privilege, but you can go into almost any small town and you've got almost the same city planner developing all of them, right? There's a town square, there's a statue of the most famous person who ever, was in that town. There's a library, a courthouse, and then the first church of whoever got there first, right? First Baptist, First Lutheran, First Methodist, depending on where they are in the country. All the other first churches are all on 2nd Street because everybody knew that the center of society was law, education, and religion. And everybody knew, in almost every case, that religion should be Christian religion. Now let's be really clear, in 1963, Billy Graham's crusades were at their peak. More people were coming to Jesus in 1963. There was practically a revival happening, even in places like Los Angeles. So there was a need for Jesus. The difference, however, is the way in which Christianity was given a place of privilege and a place of privilege and power and support by culture a generation ago. And what's changed in our world today is that piece. Darrell Guter puts it this way. He says, if Western societies have become post-Christian mission fields, then how can traditional churches become now missionary churches? And this is the challenge that's before us. This is the challenge, I believe, of this generation and the challenge of anybody who comes out of any denomination that experienced a glory days a generation ago. Our traditional churches now have to recognize that we are now actually in mission territory and that we need to make a transition in our church to now be able to thrive in this new day, this day that is much more missional right outside our door. The example that I use for this, and the example that kind of inspired the book, and if you've read the book, you know the story, but I get to tell it anyway, is the story of Lewis and Clark. So these guys are some of my absolute heroes. And I was thrilled that on Sunday I got to go to Monticello for the very first time and actually see a couple of things like a set of antlers they brought back and hear some of the stories about Thomas Jefferson's inspiration of Lewis and Clark. And so part of what's powerful about their story is, you know the backdrop, right? Meriwether Lewis and William Clark started a corps of discovery whose job was to find the water route that would connect the United States of America, that's ended right there at the Mississippi River, with the Pacific Ocean, a water route. It's an economic venture. The point of the water route is because it's easier, especially back then, to transport goods and services over water than it is over land. So for the better part of 300 years, the entire challenge of Europe was, how do we control the water routes from Asia to Europe? How do we control the water routes that will help us to be able to bring goods across water? And when Columbus and the other explorers discovered that there was this whole new world on the other side of the world, for the better part of 100 years, all they tried to do is figure out how to get through the thing, right? It took them 100 years to figure out that what they discovered was more important than what they were looking for. Because what they were looking for was a water route, and they discovered that there was a whole new world there. In that kind of history is where Lewis and Clark find themselves. Jefferson tells them, you're going to find the water route. You're going to go up the Missouri River. Start from St. Charles, Missouri. You're going to go up the Missouri River to its source. You're going to find what we know is the Columbia River on the other side that connects to the Pacific Ocean, and you're going to try to find the place where it connects. And for 300 years, people have been looking for this, and they haven't found it. So they take off, and for 18 months, they travel upstream. They spend a long winter with the Mandan tribe in what is now North Dakota, and they go all the way to the very source of the Missouri River. And on August 12, 1805, Meriwether Lewis and some of his men in a scouting crew literally put 1 foot on each side of a tiny little spring. And one of them exults that they have conquered the mighty Missouri River. For 18 months, they've been going upstream. And what they believe is going to happen is they're going to walk up to the side of the top of what's called the Lemhi Pass between Montana and Idaho. They're going to find a spring on the other side. They're going to take their canoes off one side, and they're going to put them on the other side. And after 18 months of going upstream, they're now going to get to go downstream. They're going to get to float, and they're going to have the current at their back, and after all the hard slogging upstream, they're going to head downstream. They're going to float all the way to the Pacific Ocean. They're going to exult. They're going to take a picture of it. They're going to send it back to Thomas Jefferson. They're going to have their first selfie of the New World, and they're going to turn around and they're going to go home. It's August, and if they can get some current behind them, they might be able to make it back, spend another winter with the Mandan tribe, and head home. And they step up to the top of the Lemhi Pass looking for the river that's on the other side, the river everybody knew was there. The river they've been looking for 300 years, and what they discover, you and I know, is the Rocky Mountains. Now here's one of my favorite parts of this whole story. The Mandan tribe told them, yeah, there's a river on the other side. We've been there, we've done it, it's great, it's cool, no problem. But there's some mountains in the way. And they went, mountains? Ah, we're good at mountains. We're from Virginia. We got mountains. Have you ever seen the Shenandoah Mountains? And listen, I'll be clear, they're beautiful, right? But you can imagine dragging a canoe over the rounded peaks of the Shenandoah Mountains. If these guys had no mental model for 14,000 foot peaks that would stretch on for 300 miles, that would be covered into hip-deep snow for 60 miles. They're canoers, they're water guys. They were intending on rowing their way into the New World, and they find that they now have run out of water and they're facing mountains. How do you canoe over mountains? The answer is you don't, and you can't. So what happens when you're a canoer and you face mountains? What happens when every single thing that you have thought is gone wrong? What happens when you've been trained to run rivers and you now find yourself facing mountains? What happens if 300 years of maps and assumption about the future is wrong? This is where we find ourselves today. This is the challenge of every single person sitting in a church today. We were trained for a different context. We were trained for rivers, not mountains. We find ourselves in a crisis where we have to decide that we need a new way of learning about leading. In the book, what I talk about is some rules for what we call uncharted territory. Because when they stepped over the Lemhi Pass, they literally were off the map. Dayton Duncan says that, who's a scholar on Lewis and Clark, said that when they stepped over the Lemhi Pass, that Neil Armstrong had known more about the moon when he stepped on the moon than Meriwether Lewis and William Clark knew about the American West. Neil Armstrong had seen pictures of the moon. They knew nothing about this world they were going to step into. They had been trained as river people, and their assumption was that the entire continent was the same. That there would be a long, gradual, slow uphill to a long, gradual, slow downhill. That they would be able to go up slowly and then go down slowly. They assumed everything in front of them was exactly like the world behind them. And that if they had mastered the world behind them, well, they will be masters of the world in front of them. And what they found at this moment is that the world was completely, utterly different. And this is the place where we in the church find ourselves today. We're right on the top of the Lemhi Pass. This Christendom world, this world of the culture giving us privilege, is the world that is behind us. And we are now in a new world facing forward, and we have to figure out what we're going to do. One of my other favorite stories about Meriwether Lewis is that in his journal, he writes that he saw those mountains for 3 months. They were right in front of him. He looked at them. There they are. And he couldn't compute that they were there. For 3 months, he had seen them in the journal, and what he wrote was, "I refuse to believe there will be anything but a comfortable path through there," even though they were looking at him for 3 months. It took him to that moment where he'd seen them looming in front of him, but he had no mental model for these kind of mountains, and he assumed the world in front of him would be just like the world behind him. And that's where so many of our churches are today. We just keep thinking 1963 is going to come back. That there's going to be a day where any time is going to happen, that any minute now we're going to get cultural privilege and we're going to get a home court advantage, and that the world is going to change back, and that we who've been so good at canoeing rivers are going to just get more rivers to canoe. And we find ourselves in this crisis at this moment. I just need you to know this as a Presbyterian. If December 1963 ever comes back, we're going to rule. We are awesome in 1963. Those are our glory days, and we're great at 1963. But if it doesn't come back, we're in deep trouble, because all we know how to do is row canoes, and we're now facing mountains. And it doesn't do you any good to row harder when you're running out of water. And when the world has changed so dramatically, you've got decisions to make. Do you go back? Do you start telling stories about the good old days and how great river rafting was and how awesome it was and how you should have been here and let me show you my tricks on the river? Do you get stuck? I have friends of mine who live in Denver, Colorado, right at the foothills of the Rocky Mountain. One of them said to me, "Look, Denver, Colorado was founded by hardy groups of people who made it all the way across the Great Plains and all the dangers they faced, who got to a moment where they looked up and went, right here. We're staying right here. No further. This is it, right here. Beautiful spot, great view. This is where we're going to stay." And that some of our churches, that's what they want to do. Look, we've come far enough. We've gone through a lot. We're going to stay right here as long as we can. We're just going to die in this spot. Or are we willing to be the kinds of people like Meriwether Lewis is, who got to the top of the Lemhi Pass and said, we proceeded on. They're canoers. They're water guys. They built their own keel boats. They probably would have loved this museum. They had figured out how to dig their own canoes. They had learned how to do it. They built them with their own hands, and now they had to take the things that were most precious to them, and they had to drop them, and they had to learn to lead all over again. The world in front of you is nothing like the world behind you. For most of us, this is a challenge, because the truth of the matter is we've been trained for this world that's behind us. This is the crisis that's happening in seminaries all over the country. That when you talk to people about their experience of being trained in theological education and trained for ministry and mission, what they will tell you is, the seminary that I love didn't prepare me for the world that I'm in today. This is what happened at Fuller in 2010 when we asked a bunch of our alums, How do you feel about your experience in Fuller?